Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so if I can share the screen now, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, seems like an odd way to start, but I know you're all here to hear about the building of a house, but I'm going to start you off by taking you back a bit of time. These are all famous things, but in 1997, it marks the completion of the Pompidou Center. Well, so what? Well, that's kind of was my world as a student. I arrived at the Polytechnic of Central London, very green behind the ears, with the naive idea that I was going to be taught the art of architecture, much like that little group at the top, drawing old moldings. One of our earlier projects was the design of a archive for Gertrude Jekyll's papers. Gertrude Jekyll was a gardener who worked with Edwin Lutyens. So of course I discovered Edwin Lutyens and thought, this is what they want me to do, a Lutyens style building. And I did a passable job, a bit embarrassing to look at now, but and I did not understand why I was threatened with ejection from the course immediately afterwards. That was an education of sorts. So I was a good boy after that, and ended up with a very robust modernist portfolio on my way to the University of Toronto, where I discovered that they were going through a reignition of enthusiasm for Corbusier and for someone who I'd never heard of, a guy called Hermann Hertzberger. By this stage, I'd worked a bit, and I had developed an enthusiasm for French Baroque and especially Pochet planning, the production of regular rooms in irregular geometry. They didn't go down too well at U of T, and I can tell you there were some tense moments. Yeah, there was in the middle of that, in 1984, a speech by Prince Charles, which is known as the Carbuncle speech. And I was also aware that there were people abroad who were doing traditional work, and so there was hope. So beacons of hope, Quillan Terry and Leon Krier. It didn't go that smoothly. It appeared that the modernist establishment was going to crumble in the face of all this beauty being produced, but it just doubled down on efforts to make the world even more hideous than it was. But rather than kind of lose hope, we still had a niche. I say we as the sort of traditional element, in the sense that we were doing little buildings, country houses, that sort of stuff. And that was kind of a part of life that was sort of ignored by planning. And, that goes back to the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, whose main purpose was to keep the towns out of the countryside. By 2004, the shock was that a new document called PPS 7 arrived, clause 11 of that, which TAG at the time fought a sort of bit of a rearguard action on, but completely unsuccessfully, as it passed and became law. And that instituted various things, some of them arguably okay, exceptional quality. So this is for new houses in the countryside. Innovative nature, truly outstanding. Okay, how do you measure that? Groundbreaking use of materials, bit of an odd one. But there we are. And then the big crunch was the value of such a building will be found in its reflection of the highest standards in contemporary architecture. So basically, modernism. And it was interesting because it was the first time that planning law had mandated an architectural style. And they did it in the countryside because it was deemed to be the kind of realm of people like Quinlan Terry doing country houses, and that had to be stopped at all costs. So this is the Blair government doing this. Now, PPS 7 is no longer around, and there is a much more lenient version of this. It still requires high standards and all the rest of it. The unfortunate thing is it sort of upset the apple cart, and it still hovers like a stink over the whole rural planning system, where the whole idea of modern becomes almost mandatory as well. So, I've illustrated some photographs of stuff that's gone up and always going up. The most famous one is the one on the right-hand side of the Starfish house, which they couldn't sell. And in the end, Bob Adam did a different version, which is pictured underneath it. And that seemed to work commercially. Now, excuse me, the effect of this has been to sort of litter the countryside with, I call it the countryside as a carbuncle colony of towns now, where people come out of towns with money, and rather than kind of, they like places, like I've illustrated a little Cotswold cottage in the middle that is load-bearing masonry and all the rest of it. They like those things, but for their own, they want something funky, or their architects do. But oftentimes it's something that you have to do to get through planning. And you see this all the time, and it's very distressing. Why do we abandon load-bearing masonry and the rule and the rigidity and the discipline that imposes on what you're going to end up with? And I've got the plague of Mr. McLeod on the left-hand side. Anyway, I have a very simple practice. We do country work, barn conversions into offices, and some classical work, and minor pieces like that. But almost every single project ends up with that awkward moment with the planner saying, well, have you thought of doing this in a more contemporary manner? And the astonishing thing is, it's as if I've sort of somehow, by accident, managed to stumble into doing traditional work. I've been doing it for several decades now, but the question always comes up, and it is the sort of legacy of this, PPS 7 that has just sort of clouded rural practice. Now, in a sense, that all that stuff has gone on the sort of high end of things, because you can get classical buildings built for country houses. The problem lies in the next tier or two down, where the smaller houses and minor kind of developments are being built in a resolute modern manner. Anyway, so I went through a phase of being rather jaded about all this. I sort of thought, well, there's no hope, and why am I doing this? How many years do I have to retirement? But I thought, well, pick yourself up, man, and what should we be looking at? And I was with Leon Cray once, and he said, a journalist asked him what style does he work in. He said in the Roman style, which I didn't really understand at the time, but I do now. And then there's a diagram of his on the left-hand side about essentially the message is things will return to normal. Well, they might or they might not, but there's no reason to despair. And I think we should prepare for having a language that is not fully classical, but that is vernacular, but is still nevertheless in an ordered way, and relies on masonry wall construction. And so I just go, we're talking about going back to basics. These are various Roman villas in, I think the top right one is in Spain, but the others are in England. Apart from the Roman domus, which everybody knows, where you come in, there's a complugum and implugum and all the rest of it. Well, that was city architecture. The countryside was always simple forms, as in rectangular plan form with a double pitched roof. And they formed courtyard and agglomerations of that, as you can see in these two reconstructions. In a sense, we're heading into a future that looks particularly perilous at the moment. We'll see what happens, but I think a different language should be available for people that don't necessarily want a big classical house. So it occurred to me that this art had not really disappeared, and it survived to the 19th century in agricultural buildings, which have the same kind of forms of double pitch, very practical, very aesthetically pleasing as well, and it's an accumulation of those forms to make courtyards and to make spaces. So to pick myself up, I managed to convince my poor wife that what we needed was a project. And we had been looking at this site on a disused farm at Great Gidding, and that's the picture that you see in the 1970s on the left-hand side. As you can see, just the element of the farm. I've still got a cow in it at that point. But obviously agriculture has changed. the buildings have been empty since then. And I thought, well, I'll try my idea out for sort of building in a Roman style. Obviously not telling the planners it was Roman style, it was just an agricultural style. So the farm is a big rectangle covered in concrete at the time. The picture on the top row, you see a picture of the interior. I'm actually sitting on the far corner of that room at the moment, thoroughly rebuilt, you'll be pleased to know. But it was a wreck. And the negotiation with the existing owners, we decided to parcel up the site. So I got about 2/3 of it and they kept 1/3. And I was going to build them a house. They're going to pay for the build, but I was going to build it for them as part of this development for a rental property. So these are my 3D images on the bottom. So forming a courtyard with a series of long bar buildings, agricultural or Roman, whichever way you want to look at it. And you know, it's very functional. You know, you've got parking inside, you've got access through the front. We knocked the hole out, and by some miracle, we got planning permission as well. So these are the. I'm going to talk about the house primarily because it was quite a sort of big project of 3 or 4 parts really, but the house is kind of the culmination of that. And these are my floor plans at kind of construction drawing phase. So there's a basement underneath. So you see it's got 3 rooms in it and a staircase, and then above it is you can see the long bar going across like that. And that's the roof, the main roof. And then you've got other bits kind of coming off it on the sides. So I'm sort of partly recreating a Roman house part on the quiet. As anybody that's worked with long, thin buildings, they're not terribly efficient, and there's a job to know where to put the staircase. In this case, the basement complicated it a bit more. So it does sort of protrude like that. It's joined up with various things, and it forms a corner of the courtyard. Normally, when you're planning a house, you usually need more space on the upper floor for the bedrooms and all the rest of it. And then on the ground floor. So we've got over generous ground floor, which is nice, and a sort of reasonably tight upper floor. There was then the question of, well, how am I going to make this work to make it look authentic? And the problem that we have is that we don't really have the technology in terms of building terms to do this as we used to, because we used to build in lime and solid walls and windows that leaked and all this sort of stuff. That's no longer permitted on a new building. And so in essence, the experiment on this was, can I make a building that complies with building regulations, is thermally efficient, etc., but still looks like a solid pre-modern building. And I found, and I didn't find it, but it's actually a product called a clay block. And it's a German product called a Ziegelblock, which Ziegel is just brick in German, but we call it a Ziegelblock. It's a fired block that is got lots of holes in it, so it's sort of extruded, and it has a very long thermal path through it. So it's an insulating block, but it's also masonry. And the advantage of that is that it's glued together, but it also has open perps. So it actually doesn't need a movement joint for 30 meters, which as opposed to 20 meters that you need on block work. For me, having any sort of building with chopped up into 20-meter segments loses its solidity almost immediately. So that was the idea. We're going to use these Ziegel blocks. Tried to do some research on it from the manufacturers, but all they had was what they had. I wanted to know how you build an arch into a Ziegel block. They're very good in compression from top to bottom, 40 newtons, but side to side, it's basically air. So the question about building an arch is that the loads on the stonework change. As you go down the arch, they become more vertical, and at the top you've got the opposite problem where your main force is coming down on top of, say, the keystone. We finally got around that problem. I'll show you how we did it. So anyway, so that's where we started. There was obviously an idea. It was an amalgamation of this technology, and it's fairly old technology. These Ziegel blocks, they've been around since 1860s, just we don't use them. And actually, I've tried. I have done couple of projects with them, but the builder's always been very resistant. The client, the builder always tells about, oh, they're really expensive. There's no point in using them. They are more expensive than concrete blocks, but you'll see that you can put a building up in 3 weeks rather than waiting for the cement to go off and all this. You can build an entire story in one go, and they're thick enough that you can build the outer walls and then do the infill walls afterwards. And we decided we were going to do most of the interior partitions, as it were, either mostly in concrete block, because they're not susceptible to thermal movement at that point, so there's not a problem. Anyway, so there's the elevation. So it's keep it simple. There's very little decoration. The structure and the formation is based on a series of local symmetries. So things are above each other, but it's a very muted and very subtle form of decoration. The main object of it is to keep the forms as clear as possible with the roof ridges and things like that. So, and if there are sort of things like the porches, there's a big arch, that's sort of decorative. So the 1st of September 2017, I'm going to quickly go through these because I don't want it to be like watching someone's holiday snaps. I mean, to me, it's a rather painful part of my life, but I'm not going to dwell too much. Anyway, 1st of September 2017, we arrive on site, but it's got no power, it's got no sanitation, it's got no telephone, it's overrun with mice and rats and has a very poor phone signal. So we started life building ourselves a little hut here, which we lived in for 2 years while the work was going on. The tent was our living room. I built a porch on the front of the hut for the cats to go somewhere at night. We had a temporary kitchen and all the rest of it. So the first job was to take the asbestos off the sheds. There's quite a lot of demolition, and unfortunately, our first setback was the building I'm in now was the bit that we wanted to keep of one of the barns. As soon as the roof came off, the walls fell over as well. So you'll see this is the wreckage of that. The result of which is that we were almost at the very start, we were 2 months behind. The next picture is my poor wife, who had got the job of cleaning bricks. Over the 2 years that we were doing this, she cleaned 40,000 bricks with a pressure washer. As you can see, she doesn't look very happy. Anyway, work started. We were putting in drainage. We had to get power in and things like that. So there's a lot of utility stuff there. So that's the initial phase, and then the most urgent phase after that was to rebuild the fallen barn, because I needed to move my office in here because I was starting to go mad driving to the old office and back. Anyway, so progress on that was okay. We rebuilt it as a solid wall. It was 1.5 bricks thick, as it was the original. But we did put a new pitched roof over the whole thing completely. We reused some of the trusses. It had a Pantile roof. Everything was done just in time for winter to arrive. So that was the situation in the first year. The next year, I completed the office more or less inside and moved myself in, which made life easier. The place was turning into a mound of bricks and rubble and gravel. And then the picture on the top right, you see as, I don't know what date that was, sometime in January. We were all very excited because we were going to start digging out the basement. So about 5 minutes later, the digger went through dug out a hole in the ground, as you can see the builder on the bottom left. And we found the first of 6 agricultural cisterns for water on site. Beautiful objects. I mean, they are circular, about 2 meters in diameter, all made of brick with a domed top. And I still can't figure out how they built it, because there's obviously no shoring from the inside. So clever. Anyway, Victorian stuff. Eventually the basement got dug out, the basement hole got dug out, and we put in formwork for the base slab. That was in, and then soon after that, a beast from the east arrived. You may remember that year, and we were frozen for about 6 weeks. We could do nothing. So here we are, about 3.5 months behind. Barely started, and there was a thaw, and we quickly got the concrete pump in, and we poured that. before the rains came, and it was underwater for another month, as you can see on the picture on the right, bottom right. So by this time, we are not friends with whichever gods are in charge of the weather. The ground was permeable, it was falling in, and a thorough nuisance. Anyway, I became an expert in pumps. I have 3 rather large pumps, if anybody gets flooded. Anyway, then spring arrived. So this was May. Then we started putting up the shuttering. The center photograph shows the steelwork, which we were really angry at the engineer for because it was crazy. We didn't think the concrete would get through it. Anyway, we got it all up. The picture on the top right is the inside the basement box, all shored up, ready for the pouring of the concrete. And then the bottom left is the pump back again for pouring concrete in. I didn't take those pictures because I managed at this point to fall into the basement and ended up knocked out and with concussion in hospital. But I have survived. Not all of me has recovered, I think, but the basement got poured. As you can see, the center picture is dismantling the shuttering, and the thing on the picture on the bottom right is inside the basement box, all cleaned off and with an extra layer of waterproofing cement slurry. Okay, so up we go. The basement was lined in blockwork with an insulating cavity. There's Margaret on the next photograph cleaning more bricks, this time at least in the summer. And there's the basement box as it's sticking out of the ground. Plenty of work to be digging because the house is larger than the basement, which means that you've got to dig about the same depth of trench down so that you don't get differential settlement. So it has to bear on the same ground. Pretty good ground, clay soil. So it worked quite well, and we haven't had any problems since. We had to build up those walls, as you can see on the bottom left, with basically concrete blocks laid on their sides. So, we were buying, probably caused a world shortage of concrete blocks at one point. But anyway, eventually the moment came when we capped the basement with the concrete planks and poured all the remaining screeds that were not suspended. At that point, it gets more interesting. So far, you've seen an awful lot of concrete. And then the 2 pictures on the left are the clay blocks arriving. You've got some lintels in there, and they arrived in a container, really. And we needed a forklift to get them off. But, there were a couple of deliveries, as I recall now. And this is the process. So you've got to lay a very accurate first course, which is the picture in the middle. So you have to take a bit of time over this because there's no joint to take up any errors. It's got to be dead flat and with no bumps. But you can see the structure of the blocks with this sort of cavity work. So there's a lot of air in there, and the thermal path has to follow all these little ribs all the way from inside to outside. So it works reasonably well. It's not as good as Celotex, but then this is load-bearing masonry. So there's a trade-off here. Corners are basically like Lego. You turn the corner, and they work quite well in terms of sizing. And then you, as with all masonry, bottom left-hand side, you build the corners first, you rake them back, and then you build your courses in between. You do have a correction at each story, so you have a thicker joint at each floor where you can take up any things that have arisen in that rise. The beauty of it is that once you get going, you crack away like crazy. So really, these pictures are kind of about 3 weeks apart. So you can build the whole outside. You can see the drone photo there in the middle. That's what it looked like. You do all the outside, and you just keep going upwards. This is the first of our arches. Now, we solved the problem by building basically a 1 brick thick arch across the top. Because the blocks are good in compression, we weren't worried about the bearings. And then just cut the clay blocks, the Ziegel blocks, over the top and bedded them in a cement mortar. And it's been there now for what, 4 years. No, that hasn't cracked, hasn't moved. And I can say that it's been a tried and tested method, so that worked fine. So that's the story of this. And then it climbs up very quickly. So we got to the first floor quite fast. I think it's days rather than weeks. But you notice we're building the whole of the outside in one go, and leaving all the internal partitions to later. So the floors were used eco joists, as you can see on the top left, because whatever else, you've still got to put a lot of services in here. One of the key ones is what's called a heat recovery system, which is a ventilation system. The beauty about the ventilation system is you don't need trickle joints in all your windows, which is always a shameful thing to have to put in. So I was happy about that, but it's quite a faff pulling all these pipes through. Anyway, it's so the picture on the bottom left is the ends of the joists. On this building, they're sitting on top of the blocks, just in a straightforward way. And on the other building we did, where you see on the big picture, there's a big pile of hardcore, I suppose, here. That the other house was built here, and that completes that other side of that courtyard. We'll go on to that later on. So that's to give you an idea where we are in the village on the left, and this is these are the joists now on top of the first floor. This is all happening very quickly. The stuff on the ground was endless and torturous. This is shooting up in days. And so next story up, it starts directly on top of that. We're using the joists as a platform for building this masonry, the Ziegel blocks. And now the reason why this talk is called the Orange House is that there were rumors in the village at this stage. What the hell are they building? Because nobody trusts architects anymore, and at the moment it was starting to look either a Mediterranean or the Middle East construction of some sort. And it was a hot summer, and it actually sort of did look like something out of Morocco. Anyway, I didn't really hear about it at the time, but afterwards people were saying we were wondering what you were building. Anyway, so this is the way it works. You go all the way up to the top to plate height. So you've got you see the upstairs in the central picture here. It's the upstairs. Again, no floor, no internal partitions on that side. You then go and you parge the outside, really rough bit of parging, but it's a lime sand parging. It doesn't have to be anything pretty because it's going to be hidden. Or if you want to not have bricks, you can just plaster the outside and you're done with the wall. You can also add larger openings because they do a U-shaped section. You can put reinforcement in and then cast it all in. So there are concrete elements and things like that. Anyway, things were moving, as you can see on the photograph on the right. We were feeling, excuse me, we were feeling that the worst was over. Soon after that, as you can see, you put a plate down onto cement. We used resin bolts where we needed to. The roof went on. And then you do the gables by building a bit higher, as in here, and then you just take an electric saw and you just cut them all off at an angle. So that's the thing with the roof up. That's the sort of kitchen wing, which can't happen because the scaffolding's in the way. So progress is being made, and then the autumn of 2018, our house was sort of at a stage where we could enclose it and prepare for winter. So we covered it in polystyrene or polythene. And at that point, most of the action shifted to the other house, number 72. And there's a photograph here which quite well illustrates the construction. So you start off, this is more or less ground level, so use whatever you want to. These are the reclaimed bricks mostly from the site. So there's the clay blocks with concrete lintels, and then you put and you parge it, and then you put and you cover it in brickwork. And you can deal with cold bridging within that cavity as well by putting some insulation into the cavity in front of those. Anyway, again, same thing you can see on that picture: brickwork facing, parging, blockwork inside. That's the fireplace being built. And it's only at this stage, once you get up to plate height, that you need to put scaffolding up, because you need to get the trusses and stuff on. That house rocked away because it had a big team on it. And it was well overtaken. You can see our house in the distance, unchanged from that. So a bit irritating, but there we are. So that winter and spring of 2019, we used to just plod away on the house, doing brickwork and doing various bits and pieces. You see the central picture, that's me helping out with building of the porch. There's the bricklayer. I also decided that it needed some inscriptions, so I went on YouTube and saw how you cut Trajan lettering in, and I had some spare bits of stone, so I cut some inscriptions out that got built into the walling. That's the last brick going on. Hooray! And then pretty soon after that, that was the following spring, the roofing tiles went on. As you can see, that's happening here. Now, this is coming to the end of sort of superstructure, because there was still the porch to be built. And so we did that in a very straightforward way, 2 arches in brick. And there's the bricklayer again. And you can see how this works. And this would have been a site that, if a Roman builder had turned up on site that day, would have gone, well, I know what you're doing. You're not doing it right, probably, but we were relearning. And the bricklayer was very happy with it. He hadn't done an arch, a proper arch this big, since he was a boy. So at this point, we're almost done. You can see how the courtyard now looks. And in all honesty, during the COVID outbreak, we sat in the front garden with a perfectly blue sky, the bright pan tiles, the kind of Italianate building at number 72 in front of us, and we really could have been in Italy. So there is work going on, and I'm calling it a work in progress. There's lots of stuff going on the inside, and we're quite well on. 72 is now done and tenanted. You can see how the front door of number 72 has got this stone surround. That's a view through from here into the courtyard, and that's the layout here. We do now have a garden, and we have a back patio, and a lot of the internal work is done. The kitchen's being fitted, but I was given 40 minutes to speak, and I'm just about there. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jan. It seems like it's been quite the adventure.
Yeah, the wrong kind.
But in other ways, it's been rather unique, I guess, for most architects. You tend to be behind the screen doing all the drawings and sketches and occasionally visit the site, but you've really been able to kind of have a handle at every kind of element. Did you find that you were able to kind of put in your architectural input to a higher degree because you were on, it was your site, it was your home? Yeah,
it was actually, it was really, really interesting and really educational, because I had built a house before, but it was many years before that, and it was using basically conventional stuff, block work, concrete block and all the rest of it. And so this was actually trying out something new, slightly frightening, because it's my house and I'm building an arch and I'm not sure it's going to work, but I felt like one of those surgeons in the 19th century injecting himself with a new concoction to see what happens. But it sort of all worked out. I've learned to be a bit forgiving about mistakes, whereas you go on site and you're terribly worked up because that's not been done quite the way you wanted to. But there's so much of this going on, and people interpreting things in their own way, and actually some of it's an improvement, frankly. So I sort of am much more forgiving about the builder adding his contribution.
And in some ways, it's nice that you had the opportunity to explore a bit more and have the option to fail, because when it's your client's money, you really feel like the safest option is the only option you can consider, which is status quo, which is conventional wisdom of construction.
And a lot of this, especially the work with these eagle blocks, was not documented anywhere. I mean, nobody could tell me that I could do an arch. Nobody, there wasn't any sort of body of knowledge that would help. And they used this eagle block on the Prince's Foundation house at the Building Research Establishment, which I first came across it there. Really? But really, it's a very conventional rectangular openings and things like that. So, we have had a chance to do that, even down to the internals. We wanted to use a lime finish everywhere. But you've got different materials. So you've got clay block in one wall, you've got concrete block on another wall, and a stud wall on the other one. So how do you finish this off? And we did find a product, a lime product that will do that, and it works really well as a skim coat. When you finish it off with a wood float, you still get that kind of grainy effect, and you can use on all different substrates, which is the sort of, again, another worry. Well, how, I've got plasterboard, I've got concrete block, and will I find one material that will do it all? And you do look around, and it does exist. So even on that level, and it's added quite a lot of certainty to what we specify, because we've now become very boring. We all do our buildings this way, because it's tested. But as you say, you wouldn't do this with a client, because it's too
not at all.
Yeah.
I'm just going to open it up to others who might have any questions. Feel free to write it in the chat, or just just turn on your video and feel free to join in. See that Scott has a question.
Hi, I have a question. Was it very difficult to approve all this with building control, and was there any specific requirements how you were approaching them, and submitting additional information? Were they easy to approve?
Yes, well, this is part of the same problem, is that unless you've got some BBA backing for things, people are very anxious not to have it, because it's all paper trails these days. So I have a friend who's an engineer, put it that way, and so he did all the sort of kind of stuff, the big scale stuff, the big beams and all the rest of it, and we just sort of kept quiet about arches and stuff, because even engineers have no way of proving it. But it's the oldest way of doing something. God goes back thousands of years, and why shouldn't it work? So we sort of took a risk on it. So we covered most of the bases, but again, it goes back to the idea with the building regs, that it would have been worse if we had a local authority that we used the private contractor who was more amenable to. Well, he wasn't bothered by it. He could see it was going to work. He was more interested in the plaster work at that point, because he was a plasterer. So, I mean, you do have to muddle through a little bit of ducking and diving with this, but it's at least I am now convinced that it does work. And that's the thing, that discussing it with someone at first, if you say, well, can you prove that an arch will work in this? Well, not really. So what we would have ended up doing was having to build a lintel in over the top, which is what we always do, which would have been a shame, because that's not the real experiment. So in a sense, we took a risk on it, but it worked. Phew.
We have a question. Oh, sorry, Jana. Did you have something?
Yeah, just one more question, but maybe I missed it. The outside brick. How did you connect to the outside brick and the Ziegler block somehow?
Yeah, the outside it's basically a half brick skin, and we used quite a lot of stainless steel, basically L-shaped connectors. So a bit like you do with a timber frame house. So it's
similar to cavity tie, like a ties.
Yeah, ties. Yeah, and we fixed it because these Ziegler blocks, because when we started, they looked incredibly fragile. How on earth are you going to fix to this? But actually, they're tough old things, and it's got a sort of 6 mil skin to it that's tough. It's a fired material. So we actually found that we used not raw plugs, but there's another firm that makes them. They're quite sophisticated. They sort of fold out, like for hollow fixing. And this stuff is around again because they use these blocks on the continent. So it's not such a terror. They do fix things to them. On top of everything else, you do have a parch coat, which in itself is 1/4 of an inch. So there is material to fix it into. And again, we've not had any problems. Nothing's become detached. And I think some of that is the fact that the lime is a bit softer and therefore less prone to cracking. But there's no movement joints in the entire building, so we're all right.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, the other thing is, in terms of fixings, we've all encountered resin bolts. So we use quite a lot of Hilti bolts that, come with a little mesh sock that you drill a hole. And the best way of drilling a hole in this stuff is with a steel bit. So they don't like masonry bits. You can't use a hammer action on your drill because you smash it to bits. But if you use a sharp steel tip bit, then it cuts beautifully. And then you put the sock in, you squirt the resin in, and push your lug in, and it holds it like, I thought at one stage I sort of got it in slightly the wrong place, and I was trying to get it through a hole in the timber plate I was offering up, and I found myself hammering it, and I thought, oh my, what am I doing? But it didn't crack, and it actually bent the rod, and it didn't come out. So the whole stair landing is hung off these bolts, and so is the floor. On the other house, we used on my house, I was being a bit cautious. I built the joists into the wall in pockets, whereas on the other building we use joist hangers just into a joint, and it's, again, no problems. So there's an amalgamation of using that and using modern joist construction that they don't quarrel with each other, and there's no problems with that.
Thank you.
Howard has asked a question. Howard says, thank you, Jan, it looks brilliant. Did you need any additional insulation on the inside, or were the Ziegel blocks enough?
No, nothing. It's just plastered. It's a wet plaster on the inside, and there's a parge coat on the outside. So the whole construction is extremely airtight. You don't have any plastic film or any additional insulation. It's just because you've got the two wet trades. You could get away with a plasterboard dot and dab on the inside because it's parged on the outside. So so we didn't. No, there's no extra insulation. It's a 365 block we used. On the other house, it was a 300 block, and it's still passed the building regs very nicely. The other house has interestingly enough, has an oil-fired boiler, which is almost impossible to get through. But we got the air tightness down to something like 2.3, which is almost almost as good as it can go. Yeah. So the blocks are good. They're not, as I say, they're not like Celotex, but they do one job, and they hold up the building, and they insulate, and they're robust, and the house is very quiet on the inside. It's just a kind of super material, and again, it's a 19th century product, so fantastic.
So you potentially are able to kind of reduce the external wall thickness, gain a little bit more space internally, because you combine the structural and the
could do, depending on, and they do make a 300 block, but I wanted thick walls and deep reveals, so it wasn't the thicker the better as far as I was concerned. So, but I know that they have various uses. I think the military use them for blast rooms. So because of their nature, they tried using concrete blocks, and if there was an explosion, it would knock the whole wall over. Whereas on these blocks, they actually just sort of crumple. So it's like a giant crumple zone. So if things get really ugly, you can shelter inside.
Do you by chance remember off the top of your head what the U value was for the walls?
Do you know, I'd have to look that up.
Okay, no worries. It's a technical question.
It's I'd have to look up the paperwork. I mean, they do the SAP calculation, which takes into account areas of things. So the U value is not that critical, but it wasn't bad. It easily meets building regs. Doesn't meet passive house, which you'd have to do. If you're going to do passive house, you probably have to do an extra layer of insulation, either on the inside or on the outside.
Yeah. Nigel has asked, why did you have a basement? The choice, or because the planners wanted you to keep the above ground size down?
Neither of those really. We quite like basements because we're planning to put a cinema room down there, and it's a really quiet place. Also, there's a slight slope to the ground, which was the excuse rather than the real reason. We could have gotten away without it. But in hindsight, I think it almost killed us building that basement through that winter. If I'd known what the weather was going to bring, I probably wouldn't have bothered. We use it for storage of stuff. Again, I think rationally, I would say that it was an amazingly stupid decision.
Hope you get that cinema installed soon then to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, hope everybody's happy. Yeah.
Great. So what else is left, I guess, in the development? Seems like
well, there's some work to do on the front barns. There's finishing up the inside. The garden is sort of coming along. We've not had any particular problems with anything, I have to say, which has been a bit of a relief after all that. We've done all the inside walls are done in a lime plaster as well, so they've got the same sort of texture, which is that kind of wood float. So you don't get the feeling that this is a new house at all. I mean, it's the opposite of the kind of the TV version of a new home in the countryside. It always looks old. It looks like, I mean, most people think it's a barn conversion or some old building that you renovated, which to me is the sort of mark of a decent job, frankly. You know, I don't like to stand out, won't win any awards for that, but you know, if it looks as if it's always been, and actually the feedback now from the village, apart from the scare about the orange house, they seem quite contented. And interesting enough, it is a village that has lots of farmyards, which have a very peculiar and particular kind of planning problem, because they're not counted as brownfield land, which is odd. You know, most of them were built in the 19th century as a kind of, you know, as almost an industrial scale agriculture, and yet you still have to get planning permission to change the use from agriculture to residential. And there's no let up on anything else. So brownfield would be an ideal opportunity to there's thousands of these around the countryside, and they're all redundant. So in a way, they're very tough economically to develop. We did a planning application on this same site before for 2 houses, and the owners couldn't sell it. I mean, they were just getting derisory offers, because I think primarily the developers know that the ground is full of stuff. You know, I told you about the wells, but there was also arsenic in the ground.
Oh my gosh.
Partially because the entire village burnt down in about 1863, and it was all timber framed housing at that point. So wherever you burn timber, you get arsenic in the ground. So we ended up having to dig out about 100 tons of soil and replace it with 100 tons of new soil. So you know, it's not, as an economic exercise, you know, it suits the self-builder more than a commercial development. But you know, it doesn't really matter. The exercise was to find a method of building something that is only marginally more than sort of the basic, you know, brick and concrete block cavity wall, but that is more kind of truthful to what it is, and it has its own discipline at that point. So in that sense, it was interesting. It was reasonably successful, and we have done a couple of buildings since in the same way, but you know, without worry, really.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Renee's asked another question. It seems apparent to us that hands-on work makes us much more critically prepared for each new site and project we develop. Will you carry this experience into young architects who work with you?
Well, interestingly enough, I've always, whoever I've employed, usually they're sort of the person I have now started with me as a work experience student when he was 16.
Wow.
I went off to university and became a technician and all the rest of it. But I've always been very keen on people working on site, on whatever sites we're doing. So he was sent off on regular things like to pour a concrete slab, you know, and he was there with his wellies, and you know, because I mean, I've worked in offices where you just crank out drawings, and you have absolutely no idea whether the detail you're drawing is whether it was done that way, whether people laughed at you when you got there, or you know, things like that. So So I've always encouraged whoever is assisting me to have some hands-on experience, and I quite encourage them to do work at home. A lot of DIY stuff helps as well. He doesn't have to be building things, fitting a cupboard. That's an interesting experience if you especially in the world of computers. It's even more detached from drawing with a pencil, because it's actually too exact, and you realize that nothing in this world is really measured down to the 10 decimal places. It just, I mean, some things are, I suppose, yeah. But built in the building world, if it's within 5 millimeters, you're doing very well indeed. And so there's a sort of, so in a sense, you have to design things with that expectation that it's not, that you cannot design down to zero tolerances. There has to be some room somewhere to add something, or to accept that things are not going to be straight, they're not going to be plumb, they're not going to be all the rest of it. It's not that technological process. And in a way, the sort of the prefabrication of things is sort of driving us to this idea that we can fabricate stuff in factories, bring it on and bolt it together. Well, maybe, but if it doesn't fit, then you've got a problem on your hands, and it's not that kind of technology, and you have to be able to work with what you've got. So for me personally, it was great. I do enjoy carpentry myself, so I'm doing a lot of the fit out inside, which is why it's taking so long. But I've only got weekends, so I think it's good to have that. I mean, the thing is that our profession started off as master builders essentially, and we've drifted more and more to the point where, I mean, there's something that I found first in work with other students in schools of architecture. I'd already done, in my youth, I'd fitted kitchens, I'd done all sorts of things, and these are people who are graduating as an architect who couldn't put up a shed, so what is the point of getting people who know nothing how to do drawings? One of the best examples for this, when I was working in Quinlan's office, there was an old, it's probably my age, but at the time he was old, and he was used to be a builder, and he used to do the most fantastic drawings. There was almost nothing on the sheet of paper except for what was really necessary, and it was so kind of pared down that dimensions, if they were not important, were said to be measured on site or this. So there were some critical things and stuff, but he had such a way of producing the information that the guy on site would need that we sort of don't really have. We overproduce information. So so you do a drawing, a plan, and it's covered in dimensions. And and actually, when they're building it, they have no idea which of these dimensions is critical. And inevitably they start off at the wrong side of the page, and they start off with the bit that you should have written to be determined on site. But it's an easy thing to be on a computer and think, the world is like this, and if I measure it as 3 millimeters there, that's fine. I can do, and it just, you have to be careful of things like that.
Yeah.
But you don't get that experience anymore because you don't work on site.
Maybe in some ways this is a lesson for architects to work more closely with their contractors or builders, because together, if you collaborate, potentially you might be able to work more efficiently.
Yeah, but that's down to
detail.
That's down to a sort of the contractual system that we have. If you look at the way, for instance, Pugin worked on like the Palace of Westminster, he had his chosen contractor, he had his chosen craftsman that he'd worked with before, and he didn't do a load of drawings and hand them over. They sat around in a collaborative way. They sketched out what they think should be done, and he trusted the craftsman to do this. And you look at all kind of architectural drawings up until about 1950s, the drawings on a house would literally be one page, and that's all that you needed to do. And they were basically room dimensions at that point, with a floor-to-floor height and kind of pitch, what the pitch was going to be, and coloured in with a bit of brick coloured something, and that was what you got. But interesting enough, the fees were better than they are now. So it was a much more lucrative profession because they didn't attempt to overdraw everything. And And in a way, the sort of the whole move towards, new technologies has forced the entire profession to overdraw everything. And the kind of the problem with lawyers and with things going wrong has kind of frightened everybody. And so, going back to our earlier discussion, you wouldn't do some of the things that I did with the client's building.
Yeah.
But how do you make progress in that sort of environment? So it's a sort of professional problem as well, that we don't really have this mixing of they're the professions and then there's the trades, and you don't talk to each other normally. You don't know who the bricklayer is. So I knew who the bricklayer was. I carved them a little stone slab on the side with a trowel and a Roman inscription that he was the wall builder. And he was really chuffed by it, because otherwise you do a whole building and you don't leave any personal trace. So it was a nice thing to do.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jan, for sharing that journey with us. That was really insightful and just a very innovative story, actually, in the context of traditional architecture. So I just wanted to share with everyone that our next TAG talk will be on March 31st. We'll have Francis Terry with us, another former chairman, to talk to us about some of his sketches. So stay tuned for those details. I'll stick around afterwards to chat with anyone if they wish to hang out after this. But otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you.